Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hi, I'm Hadley Heath Manning, Director of Policy at Independent Women's Forum and your host for today's Working for Women podcast. Today, I'm joined by IWF Senior Policy Analyst Patrice Onwuka. Today, we're here to discuss some recent developments in economic policy. President Trump, of course, announced new tariffs on steel and aluminum, and then days later, he chose tariff critic Larry Kudlow to replace Gary Cohn as National Economic Council Director. A lot going on in this White House, a lot going on with respect to the economy. Now it looks like other tariffs against China might be on the table too. So I'm going to be discussing all this with Patrice. Thanks, Patrice, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Hadley.
So what do you make of these announced tariffs on steel and aluminum? What can we as Americans, as workers, and as consumers expect for the outcome to be of such a policy?
Sure. So these tariffs, particularly the ones on steel and aluminum, are meant to kind of shore up these two industries here in the United States. You know, getting these companies and these mills that produce these inputs back to work, employing workers who, have seen this industry, leave in part because of foreign competition. And we're also hearing, as of yesterday, actually, that President Trump is probably going to announce a tariff on of $60 billion against imports on goods from China. So these are going to be some really major economic measures that are meant to protect American businesses. The challenge is that they're going to have some unintended consequences. When we think about tariffs, which are simply just taxes on any goods that are imported from another country, that tends to drive up the prices of goods that either use those inputs or drive up the prices of those final goods. So, for example, we put together a really interesting blog post of the 10 things that, everyday items you can expect to see the prices rise on because of a tariff on aluminum. Things like cans of soup, Campbell cans of soup, aluminum ladders, for example. These are all inputs. But when we look at a tariff on goods from China, for example, we may see an increase in the price of electronics, our iPhones, our laptops. And in part because China is not just mass producing these products, but they're also providing some of the finishing touches or assembling different products, different pieces, and then shipping them here to the United States. So it has a really big effect on how much consumers pay every day for the goods that they rely on. I think it also has an impact on the industries, manufacturing industries in particular, that use things like aluminum and things like steel to produce other goods. So what will a company do when the cost of producing something increases because of, let's say, a tariff? They're either going to absorb those costs, which means that they're going to have less money to hire new workers. They could potentially fire workers or not expand their businesses. Alternately, they could just raise prices. And again, that's where consumers would end up paying more for the goods even manufactured by other American companies. Even if the tariff isn't specifically on that good, but it's on kind of the input for the good that they're buying. So, and third, unfortunately, we could touch off what you call a trade war, where our trading partners will say, well, if you're going to raise tariffs on the goods that you're importing from my country, I'm simply going to do the same thing on some of those other goods that are imported as well. So, you end up having trade wars. And again, consumers end up losing, and even producers end up losing because, American companies that export goods to other countries will now see that their goods are coming into, their customers in other countries at a higher price. And again, that discourages really commerce. It discourages people from buying overseas of American goods. So overall, I think there's some really key concerns around tariffs that we have to be careful about. And I think from a policy perspective, we believe in free markets, and we do, and not just because it sounds like a really nice idea, but because there are significant costs and benefits that are attached to it.
I agree, Patrice. Free markets and free trade make all people everywhere more prosperous. And I suspect that President Trump generally agrees with that statement. He seems like, a free market capitalist, at least in his approach to economic policy here at home with the, reduction of our tax rates and a deregulatory stance. I know his White House has been working very hard to peel back some counterproductive regulations on the economy, and he's a businessman, so I don't think any of this is lost on him. And I know there's also been some discussion about whether President Trump is imposing tariffs simply for the sake of imposing tariffs, or if there's something bigger at work here that within the broader context of our trade policy, President Trump might be using these tariffs as a negotiating tool, as a strategy to bring certain trade partners to the table to renegotiate some of our other arrangements. So can you talk about that idea, whether the tariffs, in the broader context of this goal of rebalancing power in our trade deals, is that maybe what's going on here?
I think it has a lot to do with it. So when President Trump first announced these tariffs, he talked about that the United States loses $800 billion a year on trade. And he's referring to our U.S. trade deficit, which is how much the difference between what we export versus what we import. And so he's suggesting that, we're not exporting enough and we're importing far too much. And if, let's say, we have policies like tariffs, that we can boost U.S. production of goods. Also, these tariffs, as you suggested, could be just a leverage tool, a way to renegotiate our direct trade agreements with countries, and as well as the North American Free Trade Agreement that we have with countries like Canada and Mexico. So I think it's an interesting bargaining or kind of deal-making tool that he's trying to use these tariffs for. I do agree, though, that, the president is a businessman. He understands that, U.S. markets, new markets are opened up when we are trading, around the world, where we're producing what we specialize in and do a really great job at creating efficiently, and then trading with people, with other countries, and vice versa. So I don't think that there's a necessarily ill will or just tariffs for the sake of tariffs, but in part because it could be a leveraging tool. And when we look at the tariffs with aluminum and steel, we see that originally there were going to be no exemptions for any country. This was going to be just a blanket tariff. Then we saw that there have been some exemptions made for for Canada as well as Mexico, and the administration is going to take a case-by-case approach to other countries that are going to request an exemption as well. So, it sounds like this is probably going to be the way forward when it comes to different types of tariffs. Now, the tariff on China that we're expecting as early as maybe Friday of this week, that's probably going to be limited to one country, but there may be exemptions around the types of products and goods that could be exempted as well. So there's wiggle room in all of these different measures.
And the president's executive authority is pretty broad here, based on U.S. statute. So I think we can recognize, and I think you're doing an excellent job articulating the IWF position on tariffs, is that there's a lot of downsides and risks associated with a trade policy like this. We don't like restrictions on free trade. We understand free trade is it's good for our economy. It's good to be a part of a global market. But we also understand that tariffs may be a strategic tool, a negotiation tactic. And that's exactly the position of another very well-known economist. And I'm talking about Larry Kudlow. And this is the new director of the National Economic Council. And I should mention at this point, maybe one reason that we share Mr. Kudlow's position on free trade, we share a lot of positions with him. He's been a longtime friend and even a board member at Independent Women's Forum. So we're fond of Mr. Kudlow. Several of us have used to appear on his TV show on CNBC called The Kudlow Report. But what else can you tell us, Patrice, about his background, about his positions on economic policy, and sort of what we can expect from Larry Kudlow as the new director of the National Economic Council?
Well, it's an exciting, it's an exciting appointment. I think Mr. Kudlow brings a really interesting background. I mean, he's got started at the Federal Reserve Bank. That's where he held his first position. We're getting his feet wet with national economic policy. We've seen him serve in the Reagan administration in various economic advisory roles. And he's just been a prolific, really articulate advocate for free markets, for lower taxes, for pro-growth strategies like deregulation, that will serve really well in advising the president. I can imagine, and people are often asking us about, the people who serve in the White House and whether there are conflicting views. But I think he's going to, Mr. Kudlow will bring a really strong free market voice, but also recognize where the United States needs to be strategic in the decisions it makes and the measures that it employs to ensure that, we get the best trade agreements that we can possibly negotiate and that we are in a stronger economic position in the future. So, I think he's going to be great, and it'll be interesting to hear him, transfer a lot of his strong talking ability on CNBC and network television to a role where he may have a very public-facing, media engaging role.
I imagine he will. I think he'll be an asset in more ways than one to the Trump administration and to the whole country. So this has been really great information, Patrice. I really appreciate you joining me for this discussion today. And if there's any listeners who have tuned in and you're curious to learn more about economic policy and other issues, current events, we cover a lot on IWF.org. And you can follow us on social media at the handle @IWF on Twitter. Patrice and I are also on Twitter. I'm at Hadley Heath and Patrice is at Patrice Pinkfile. We'd love to know what you think about today's podcast and about the president's announcement of various new tariffs and generally his approach to trade policy. I really enjoyed this discussion. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate Patrice joining me, and I appreciate those of you who've tuned in for this edition of our Working for Women podcast. See you next time.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by IWF.org for similar content.